Hey, eighth graders, happy Tuesday. Welcome back to Notes and Lecture. We are going to be starting the Road to the Civil War. I posted these notes, they're blank on a Google assignment on your Google Classroom. So obviously, these red letters won't be in there, or the type parts that are red will not be in there because this is the answer key. You'll have a blank one, so you can type in your own notes in these. I will post this answer key when we're done. This slide is a pretty big one based on what you can see of the notes. It's, I think, 7 pages. So we're gonna chunk this up over more days than normal, possibly 2 weeks. So we'll just go back and forth to this and do some activities and have the Friday work day for homework. So don't worry, I promise it will not be like one day of like 30 minutes of notes. I would never do that. Well, I wouldn't do that on online schooling at least. So the road to civil war was basically between the Union and the Confederates, and the gas that lit the Civil War fire was whether or not to abolish slavery in the like all the United States or just certain parts of the states. So let's go ahead and get into that with this. My slides are for some reason not loading onto full screen, so I apologize. They might be a little smaller than normal, but always know that you can put your YouTube video on full screen and then pause it whenever you need help typing anything. And make sure that also it's a little bit easier if you split your screen, have notes on one side, video on another. All right, anyway, so the Missouri question. So at this point, there are 22 states that are a part of the United States of America, 11 were free states and 11 were slave states. So at this point, there was some kind of balance that was reached. So in 1818, the Senate was balanced between 11 free states and 11 slave states. Therefore, each side has the same representation in the Senate. So, with the Senate only having the equal number of representation, no matter the size of the state, this was looking very equal: one state, one representative, and then there being an equal split between free and slave states. So, this was a big positive at the time. In 1820, Missouri wanted to join the Union states as a slave state. So the southern states would have the majority of seats in the Senate, which obviously was a big negative to the northern states. The northerners fought against this. So the big Missouri question was, what would the Senate do, or what did Congress have the power to do to regulate slave states versus free states? Again, make sure that if I'm going too quick, you go ahead and pause this video so you can type down your own notes. The Missouri Compromise, Missouri would enter the U.S. as a slave state, but Maine would enter the United States as a free state. So, with this, they were trying to make sure that there was equal representation as much as possible between slave states and free states. So, if you look at this map here, let me see if I'm able to zoom in on this without messing up this too much. Here we go. Oh, that is perfect. So, the green being the free states and then the red being the slave states. This was kind of the representation. Obviously, you can see that it's divided pretty equally between north and south, or the northern part of the United States here and the southern part of the United States right here. And then having Missouri be admitted as a slave state in 1821, and then Maine being admitted as a free state in 1820. So here is a nice, not, I mean, obviously not a clear line of division, but it kind of goes along the borders of these states. And this is what they call the 3630 Missouri Compromise line, which we're going to talk about here in just one moment. Oh, that's way. There we go. All right, moving forward. As part of the Missouri Compromise, Congress drew an imaginary line across the southern border of Missouri at latitude 36 degrees 30 north. Slavery was permitted in the part of the Louisiana Purchase south of that line, but it was banned north of that line. So Missouri was the only exception. So right here, Missouri being a little bit above that imaginary line, as you can see, this was the only place where it was acceptable to have slaves, but everything above and below was supposed to be separated. These were free states, these were slave states, and then it was essentially up to the states to regulate and like administer that as like a law. So slavery in the Mexican secession. Remember, we talked about this when we were looking at the Alamo 2 weeks ago, and whether Mexico was going to secede or Mexico and Texas were seceding from the Union and whether Texas was going to become an official state of the United States. So we talked about that then. So kind of recap that in your mind. The Missouri Compromise only applied to the Louisiana Purchase. So all that land that was purchased in the Louisiana Purchase. The land from the U.S. received from the Mexican secession added a large amount of land to the U.S. So again, we are still gaining lots of land and lots of territory that is going to be needed to be defined as whether it is a slave state, is a free state, and how Congress and Senate are able to like determine or define what is each with the representation that they have in the Senate from each of the independent states or each of the states. The question arose, would slavery be allowed in the Mexican secession? So the Mexican secession started in 1848, and it was this land or this territory right here where California and Arizona are. And the question was obviously, would that be allowed? So while we're thinking about this, I want you to kind of go back to your do now, which I posted for today on Tuesday, which is how do you think territory or the location of a piece of land judges whether or not a state should be considered a slave state or a free state? How would that factor? And obviously, if you're listening to these notes, you're going to get the answer right now. So win-win. Because if you are living in a state that is highly or is gaining all of its power and its successful and economic value is based on agriculture, and that means by farming, producing crops, distributing crops. Those are the states that are going to need to rely on human labor, and that is the states that is going to need the most people doing things in like on the farms, and by that cheap labor that usually ends up equaling to slavery. So if you were living in a location that is susceptible to high agriculture needs, high farming needs, and high human labor needs, that is where slavery is obviously going to be desired the most. Whereas if you're looking at a state that is relying on manufacturing, maybe factories, looking at those capital and material resources that we talked about last week, those are the states that are going to be more encouraging of free states or abolishing slavery altogether. So if you were listening, then that was your answer for the do now. So real quick, Americans taking sides. Obviously, we can or we can make this assumption that the North, a very, very, very large majority of Northerners were abolishing slavery. A very, very large part of the Southerners were very encouraging and supportive of slavery being instated in their parts of the area or other parts of the United States. The Mexican American War strengthened feelings of sectionalism in the North and South. So remember that sectionalism is like loyalty and patriotism towards your individual state versus the United States of America as a whole. So when I say that, I say that I'm more passionate about being from Ohio versus passionate about being an American. So being loyal to your state specifically. Sectionalism also means that people feel loyalty to their state or section instead of the whole country. So, yeah, just what I was just saying. So, Northern abolitionists are people that wanted to abolish slavery, demanded that slavery be abolished throughout the whole country, and a growing number of people agreed. So, we're going to talk about the things that were happening in the world that were, like, for example, media, pop culture. And by pop culture, I mean that was obviously defined very differently than it is now. But what people were being exposed to that was making people against slavery more and more and making people more passionate, intense about this subject than ever before. So obviously the Northerners didn't say, oh, they were not in the mindset of, well, we don't want it here, but I guess, you do what you want to do across the Missouri line. It was, we need to abolish slavery every way, everywhere. We are a part of one United States, and by united, we need to unite and be against slavery. So, however, Southern slave owners thought that slavery should be allowed in all territories and also that escaped slaves should be returned. So, obviously, there was a major question of what would happen if a slave escaped and went across the Missouri line from south to north and then all of a sudden was finding themselves in a territory or a location that they were considered free. What does that mean? And Southerners are very passionate by saying they are considered, in quotes, property, so that property should be returned. even though, as human rights would say, that no human is considered a piece of property. So Northerners were on the side of, if they make it to a free state, then they are considered free. So this was something that they were arguing with in Senate. The representatives were also very strongly passionate about whether or not slaves should be returned to their owners, whether they should be considered free, depending on the location that they find themselves on. So this was also a big debate, and then also being able to identify, like, if a slave um, was considered free in one place, but then traveled across the Missouri line, would they all of a sudden be considered free even though they had traveled across the line? So it was just one of those things that became really, really complicated. Wilmot Proviso in 1846. This was an amendment proposed to appropriate, and by appropriate I mean give to the new territories acquired from the Mexican American War. That says that these territories should not be open to slavery. It was passed twice in the House, but was denied in the Senate, causing more tension between the North and South because this difference and balance was tilting one side or the other. It was no longer finding a clear balance, so this was um, causing big tension between North and South, which eventually will lead to what is known as the Civil War. So we're looking at these stepping stones of what is causing tension, what leads to this war, when this war finally breaks out, and how it results. So right now we're still looking at the stepping stones of tensions rising, potential compromises that are trying to be met, and then eventually fail, and then breakout of the war, and the declaration of the war, and then what happens because of that, or the impact of that. So we are going to stop for right now. We are going to continue with the Compromise of 1850 tomorrow. So thank you guys so much, and you will be hearing from me soon.